Hello, my name is Nicki Ward, and today I'd like to talk about a book of poetry and do a recitation of one of the poems from this book of poetry called Old Possum's Book of Practical Cats, written by somebody who self-described as Tommy Possum. Excuse me, I'm so sorry. More famously, he was known as T.S. Eliot. He was called, given the nickname Possum, by Ezra Pound, who was a famous poet of the last century. And Ezra Pound said it was because T.S. Eliot played dead, which is... anyway, he stuck with the nickname. This is taken from the first edition of the British edition, which he inscribed it when inscribing it for children, Tommy Possum. So it's rather sweet. This was influential to a number of people, and firstly, and more importantly, but more relevantly to me, this was tremendously influential to me. As a child, I read this and I was charmed by it. Loved cats, and I loved how whimsical this was, and it talked about the secret lives of cats, and which we all suspect them to have. And it was just a delight and a beautiful bit of whimsy. I had no idea that T.S. Eliot was this great lauded lion of English literature, who ultimately won the Nobel Prize for his contributions to literature. Is considered to be, by many, and myself included, to be a genius in a number of different forms, but particularly in the modernist movement at the first part of the last century. The two key works probably he's best known for, although there may be some controversy about this, are the Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, which he wrote when he was only 22, but he has got great maturity to it, and then The Wasteland, which is this epic poem written in the backdrop of a time of great strife in his life, and very serious, but also very moving pieces. And for those people who are enthusiasts, this is the work for which he is best known and perhaps most applauded. But the fact is, this book went on to inspire many people, not just myself, but important artists who composed classical works of music around it, and or popular musical pieces like the musical Cats. Cats is not just inspired by this small handcrafted book of poetry. It is actually it's lifted in large chunks from this book. The names of the cats are Mungo Jerry, Old Deuteronomy. These are all characters that are featured in this book of Grisabella, of course. Featured in this book. Interestingly, Grisabella was introduced in a later edition, and of course Grisabella is central to the Andrew Lloyd Webber musical. The book of poetry is a collection. It's not a narrative, and of course in a musical there has to be some sort of narrative, and Grisabella is critical to that. Anyway, the biography of T.S. Eliot here. Got a few notes. He was born of a rich family in the northeast of the United States of America. He would be described as a Boston Brahmin. And then the accent that is used by the northeastern intellectuals is very, very crisp, almost deliberately anglicized in its pronunciation and very explicit. And in fact, that is echoed in some elements of this poem. There is a line in the poem where it says, "a name that's peculiar." Now, this poem follows a strict regimen, 12 syllables per line. Line structure is A, B, A, B, and with an emphasis on the 8th syllable of the line. And then there's a line in here that says, "a name that's peculiar and more dignified." And if you do it in this Northeastern American or a name that's peculiar, it has to be peculiar. All of those syllables are announced, otherwise the line falls apart. Today, we would say peculiar and slur those syllables, but it's peculiar. Now, I haven't made a point of that. Watch me mess it up when I actually do the recitation. Never mind. So that's something about the accent. But he didn't stay there. He moved on to St. Louis, Missouri, which is the home state of Mark Twain. It's in the central part of the United States and below the Mason-Dixon line, so it would have been a southern drawl in there. And so you can also see how the same line, a name that's peculiar and more dignified, a name that's peculiar and more dignified also works, right? That's built into it too. Eliot moved to Europe relatively early on, studied in Oxford, which has its own very crisp kind of, the Oxford University has its own internal dialects or language, special words that they used and pronunciation. He lived and worked in northwest London, where I'm originally from, and there is a rhythm to the language there that would be embedded in this poem. Because it was built over time. This was taken from letters to his godchildren, just bits of fluff that he sent out into the world while he was doing all these other serious and theoretically important things. Although I think this is actually probably the most important thing he did. More about that in a second. So the accenting of this piece very, very, very tricky. It's meant to be read to children, and so there is an exaggerated storytelling style to this, which has to be embraced because that's part of its charm. And as you'll see, that's informed my recitation of this. Make your own choices. This is why recitation of poetry is valuable. You make your own choices. You look into that. As to T.S. Eliot, the man, well, at some point, the work is greater than the man himself. I think this is a very gentle, kind person, but some of his attitudes, measured by today's standards, just don't translate. Some people have accused him of being a misogynist, possibly true. Not uncommon in men in the 1920s. Was he a racist? Sure. I mean, we wouldn't be of the time. He would have just thought himself naturally gifted and all other races inferior. But that's a product of being white British of the time. Not correct, but I mean, that was just the way of the world. And it's also suggested that he was anti-Semitic. Some of his poems, frankly, can't be, recited these days without a lot of backfill. This is not true of this. There are some bits here that, well, anyway, it doesn't matter. You make your own decisions. And as people have made the fact that he certainly had a complicated relationship with women. Was he gay? Well, the term gay doesn't really matter. Doesn't work. Gay is a relatively new term. He had difficult relations with women, liked them possibly in a more abstract way. Who knows? Frankly, who cares? If one only reserves study and enjoyment of artists whom one thinks are nice people, then you end up with a fairly short list. Some of the greatest artists have been absolute monsters as human beings, and that's just the way it is. I'm not saying Eliot is a monster. I'm just saying that you can't judge folks like this on one's own personal morality. It was wasn't just it was a different time. It was a different time. Prufrock predated women getting the vote in about the same time. So can't really judge it based on that. But this was a kind man trying to be kind to children in the backdrop of the late 1930s is when he wrote this. Published in 1939, so done prior to that. You're not going to write to a child about the rise of fascism in Europe, although Eliot was quite capable of that. And the Wasteland, his two key works, I think, the Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, which I'm going to take a run at later on, and the Wasteland, which I'm going to read, but I'm not sure if I have the grit to do a full recitation of something of that magnitude. We'll see, maybe. But these are serious works, not meant to do anything. They are just serious works that are worthy of study and exploration. Back to this poem here, though, with Andrew Lloyd Webber musical Cats is lifted wholesale from this. The names of the characters, the elements, Mungo Jerry, Old Deuteronomy. Grisabella was added after 1939, which is relevant because Grisabella is a central character in the Andrew Lloyd Webber musical. But Andrew Lloyd Webber was not the only artist to be inspired by this simple, whimsical book. There are classical compositions of music. Many folks, visual artists, performance artists, word artists, have all been. Many of us have been moved by this, and this informs my understanding. So, what's more important as a work? Is it The Wasteland, or is it this book that is somehow influenced literally billions of people? The illustration, by the way, of over here was done by T.S. Eliot, who clearly didn't take himself too seriously. And next to T.S. Eliot is his cat, the gentleman in spats, to whom this book is in part dedicated. I think that's a kind man, to be honest with you, and with feet of clay, as we all have. Anyway, enough about that. I've talked about his biography. I've talked about the accenting behind it. Talked a little bit about the form, which is balladic and deceptively simple. Do try doing this out loud. It's really tricky. The form, and I think that's enough yattering from me. I am now going to just put the text up there for you. It's a little small. But I'll also put it below so that you can go along for the ride with me. You'll also be able to catch me out in any mistakes I make, which I shall try not to do. So, The Naming of Cats by T.S. Eliot, from his Old Possum's book of Practical Cats. The naming of cats is a difficult matter. It isn't just one of your holiday games. You may think at first I'm as mad as a hatter when I tell you a cat must have 3 different names. First of all, there's the name that the family use daily, such as Peter, Augustus, Alonzo, or James, such as Victor, or Jonathan, George, or Bill Bailey, all of them sensible, everyday names. There are fancier names, if you think they sound sweeter, some for the gentlemen, some for the dames, such as Plato, Admetus, Electra, Demeter, but all of them sensible, everyday names. But I tell you, a cat needs a name that's particular, a name that's peculiar and more dignified. Else how can he keep up his tail perpendicular, or spread out his whiskers, or cherish his pride? Of names of this kind I can give you a quorum, such as Munkustrap, Quaxo, or Coricopat, such as Bombolurina or else Jellylorum, names that never belong to more than one cat. But above and beyond there's still one name left over, and that is the name you never will guess, the name that no human research can discover, but the cat himself knows and will never confess. When you notice a cat in profound meditation, the reason I tell you is always the same. His mind is engaged in a rapt contemplation of the thought, of the thought, of the thought of his name, his ineffable, effable, ever ineffable, deep and inscrutable, singular name.